Listen. A single sound cuts across the dark of a Norman field. Metal against metal, sharp and small, no louder than a fingernail flicked against a wineglass. Click. Then the sound is gone, swallowed whole by the night, and what remains is a silence so complete it has weight. It presses down on the wet grass, on the black tangle of hedgerow, on the man crouched at the base of that hedge with his knees in the mud and his breath held tight in his chest. It is roughly 1:30 in the morning on the 6th of June, 1944. The man does not know where he is. He knows only that he is somewhere in France, that he jumped from a burning sky an hour ago, that the men he trained with for 2 years are scattered across the countryside like seed thrown by a careless hand, and that on the far side of this hedge, 6 feet away, perhaps less, something has moved. A boot shifting in soft earth, the whisper of cloth, a living presence, breathing in the dark close enough to touch. So he does the only thing he can do. He raises his hand, and in his palm is a small brass toy, a child's noisemaker, the kind you might have won at a county fair or pulled from a box of caramel corn, and he squeezes the bent steel tongue until it snaps against the housing. Click. That is his question. One click. It means, I am here. Are you a friend? And now he waits. 2 seconds pass. The field does not answer. 4 seconds. The presence on the other side of the hedge has gone still, utterly still, the stillness of a thing that has heard something and is deciding what to do about it. The trooper's thumb rests against the trigger of his rifle. His heart is a drum against his ribs. Somewhere in the distance a machine gun stitches its slow, deliberate line across the horizon. An anti-aircraft fire blooms and fades like summer lightning. But here, in this small pocket of the world, there is only the man, the hedge, and whatever waits beyond it. He is listening for one thing. He is listening for a second sound to answer his first. 2 clicks. Click-clack, click-clack. That is the reply that means friend. That is the sound that means the shape in the dark is an American boy from Ohio or Georgia, or the coal country of Pennsylvania, a boy who trained beside him, who will grip his forearm in the dark and grin with relief, and together they will move on and try to win this war. But there is another possibility. If no answer comes, if the silence simply stretches and stretches until it snaps, then the man on the other side of the hedge is not a friend. He is the enemy. And in that case, only one of them will walk out of this field. So the question hangs in the air of Normandy, unanswered, on the most consequential night of the 20th century. Did anyone click back? This is the story of that sound. It is the story of a 5-cent toy, a thing of bent steel and stamped brass, no bigger than a matchbox, that was pressed into the hands of thousands of young men and asked to do something it was never designed to do, to tell the living from the dead, the friend from the foe, in the blackest hours of the largest amphibious invasion in human history. It is the story of how a band leader's timekeeping gadget and a child's Cracker Jack prize became, for one long night in the hedgerows of France, the difference between a man's next breath and his last. And it is the story of the men who carried it, men who jumped into darkness not knowing where they would land, or with whom, or whether the sound they made would save their lives or give them away. To understand how that toy came to be clutched in a paratrooper's fist over Normandy, you have to travel backward, away from the burning sky and the scattered sticks of frightened men, back across the channel to the grey warehouses and toy shops of wartime England, and back further still to a workshop in the English Midlands, and a novelty item that had been rattling around the pockets of children for a generation, before anyone thought to send it to war. Its proper name, in the flat language of the military, was the ANM-40, but almost no one called it that. To the men who carried it, and to history ever after, it was the cricket. Hold one in your hand, and the first thing you notice is how little it weighs. It fits neatly in a closed palm, a small oblong of brass with a curved steel tab riveted along its length. The brass is warm-coloured, the yellow of an old coin, and it has a machined smoothness that fills the hand pleasantly. Press the steel tab down with your thumb and it bends against its own tension until, snap, it flexes past the point of resistance and cracks against the metal body. Release it, and it snaps back with a second, slightly different note. Down, up, click, clack. 2 sounds from one press, sharp and dry and carrying, a sound with an edge to it that cuts cleanly through wind and distance in a way the human voice never can. That was the whole of it. There was nothing more to the device. No battery, no mechanism to fail, no moving part beyond that single flexible tongue of stamped spring steel. You could drop it in a puddle and it would work. You could bury it in mud, wipe it on your trousers, and it would work. You could jump out of an airplane at 400 feet with it stuffed in a pocket, and when you hit the ground it would still be there, still ready, uncomplaining and dumb and reliable in a way that almost nothing else on that night would prove to be. It had not been born for any of this. The design was old, older than the war, older than the men who would carry it. It traced back to the 1920s, to the workshops of J. Hudson and Company in Birmingham, the firm that traded under the name Acme, known the world over for whistles. Acme made the whistles that referees blew and policemen carried and shepherds used to call their dogs. They had built an entire enterprise around the manufacture of small, precise, reliable sounds, and somewhere in their catalogue, tucked among the trilling whistles and the sirens, was a humble little clicker, the Acme number 470. It was a bandleader's tool, a thing a conductor might use to tap out a tempo, to signal a change in a piece of music, a small mechanical metronome that could cut through the noise of an orchestra with a clean, repeatable click, and it was a toy. On both sides of the Atlantic, in the years between the wars, that same simple clicking mechanism found its way into the hands of children. In America they were dime store novelties, sold for pennies at the 5 and 10, tin-stamped and cheerfully useless. They turned up as prizes at the bottom of crackerjack boxes, wrapped in wax paper beside the caramel corn, a small tinny surprise for a child to fish out and press again, until a parent begged them to stop. They were the sound of a birthday party, of a schoolyard, of idle summer afternoons. If you had told a child in 1935, snapping a brass cricket in the back of a Model A on a Sunday drive, that this exact sound would one day mean life or death to a paratrooper in a foreign field, the child would not have understood you, and neither would you have believed it yourself. That is the strange truth at the heart of this story, the almost absurd gap between what the cricket was made for and what it was about to be asked to do. It was designed to amuse. It was designed to keep time. And now it was going to be handed to a 19-year-old with a rifle and a parachute and told, "This small toy is how you will know whether the man in front of you deserves to live." How does a thing like that happen? How does a child's novelty become an instrument of survival? To answer that, you have to understand the problem the planners were trying to solve. And to understand the problem, you have to understand the man who went looking for a solution. The airborne divisions of the United States Army were, in the spring of 1944, a new and largely unproven kind of weapon. The idea behind them was audacious: to drop thousands of soldiers out of the sky behind enemy lines, in the darkness before a great invasion, so that they might seize bridges and crossroads and gun positions before the defenders could organize. It was a bold concept. It was also a nightmare of logistics and chance, because the moment those men left their aircraft, the ordinary rules of soldiering fell away. There were no lines, there was no front. There was only a scattered mass of individual men, dropped in darkness across a wide swath of enemy country, each one landing alone or nearly alone, each one having to find the others before the enemy found him. The Americans had tried this before in the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, and the lessons had been bitter. The drops had gone wrong in a dozen ways. Aircraft had been scattered by wind and flak and inexperience. Men had come down miles from where they were meant to be, in the wrong fields, on the wrong hills, sometimes in the sea. And once on the ground, in the confusion and the dark, they faced a terror that no amount of training had prepared them for. The terror of not knowing who was near you. A rustle in the grass, a shape moving along a wall. Was it a comrade, lost and searching like you? Or was it a German patrol hunting the scattered invaders one by one? In daylight you could see a uniform, a helmet, a face. In darkness you had nothing. And the human voice, that first instinct, to call out, to whisper a name, was worse than useless. To speak was to announce yourself in a language the enemy would recognize instantly. To answer a challenge with the wrong password, misheard or mangled by fear, was to die. Men had been shot by their own side in the confusion of Sicily. Men had frozen, unable to move, because to move was to risk being taken for the enemy by their own friends. The very darkness that was supposed to protect the paratroopers had turned against them, and the planners of the next great airborne operation knew they could not let it happen again. Among the officers who had watched the chaos of those earlier drops and refused to accept it was Maxwell Davenport Taylor, a brigadier general who would take command of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, and lead them into Normandy. Taylor was a soldier of a thoughtful, almost scholarly cast, a man who spoke several languages and who approached the problems of war with a careful, analytical mind. And the problem of nighttime identification gnawed at him. He understood, perhaps better than most, that the success of the coming invasion might hinge not on grand strategy, but on 10,000 tiny moments of recognition, on whether one frightened man in a hedgerow could tell, in the space of a heartbeat, whether the shape in front of him was a brother or an enemy. There was already a system in place, the old and universal system of every army in the dark, the challenge and the password. A sentry would call out a challenge word. The correct reply was a second, agreed-upon word, changed daily so the enemy could not learn it. The Normandy paratroopers would indeed carry such words. Their challenge for the drop was flash. The answer was thunder. And there was a third word, welcome, a countersign to confirm the exchange. The words had been chosen with care, chosen in part because the thee sound in thunder was notoriously difficult for German speakers to pronounce, a small linguistic trap laid in the dark. But the spoken password had a fatal flaw, and everyone knew it. To use it, you had to speak. You had to make a sound that carried your accent, your fear, your very identity across the black field to whoever was listening. And in those first moments after landing, disoriented, alone, unsure whether the men 50 yards away were friends or a German machine gun crew, speaking might be the last thing a man ever did. There needed to be something quieter, something faster, something that carried no accent, no language, no clue to nationality, a sound that any man could make instantly, and that the enemy, hearing it, would not recognise as a signal at all. That was the problem the cricket was born to solve. Somewhere in the planning for Normandy, someone, and the records do not tell us with certainty who first proposed it, remembered the little brass clicker, the band leader's toy, the dime store novelty, and saw in it exactly what was needed. It made a sound sharp enough to carry but strange enough to mean nothing to an untrained ear. It required no words. It could be worked in total darkness, one-handed, while the other hand held a weapon. A single press was a challenge, a double press was the answer. Click and wait, click-clack in reply, and you knew. It was in its way a stroke of genius, the kind of humble, practical genius that wins wars in the small places history rarely looks. But an idea is one thing. 7,000 physical objects sourced and gathered and placed into the hands of 7,000 men in the crowded, secret-ridden weeks before the invasion is another thing entirely. Someone had to actually find the crickets. Here the story passes out of the realm of grand decisions and into the grey, unglamorous world of army supply. The world of requisitions and shipping manifests, of staff officers with clipboards and quartermasters counting crates, the vast and largely invisible machinery that must move before a single soldier can fight. Every rifle, every ration, every parachute and pack and pair of boots that went into Normandy had to be ordered, procured, counted, and delivered by men whose names would never appear in the after-action reports. The war was won as much in warehouses as on beaches, and somewhere in that machinery, the order for 7,000 crickets had to be placed and filled. Popular retellings of this story have handed the errand to a supply officer of the 101st, a lieutenant colonel remembered in some accounts as Sidney Ulmer, of the division's G4 section, the branch responsible for logistics and supply. In the telling, the task falls to him in the spring of 1944. Go and find crickets, thousands of them. And the image that comes down to us is a memorable one. A staff officer, a serious man in a serious war, moving from toy shop to toy shop through the streets of wartime London and Birmingham, emptying the shelves of children's novelties while the greatest invasion in history assembles around him. There is a quiet absurdity to the picture, and it has helped keep the story alive. The incongruity of a soldier buying up dime store toys by the crate, of the machinery of war reaching down into the world of childhood and gathering up its small tin trinkets for a deadly purpose. Here honesty compels a pause, because the documentary's duty is to the truth, and the historical record is not as tidy as the legend. The name attached to that procurement mission does not appear in the confirmed archival record in the way the popular story would have it. The well-documented driving force behind the cricket's adoption was General Taylor himself, acting on the hard lessons of Sicily. What can be said with confidence is this. The 101st Airborne Division placed a bulk order for approximately 7,000 of the clickers, and that order went to J. Hudson and Company, Acme Whistles, in Birmingham, England, the very firm that had been making the little brass No. 470 for a generation. That is the solid ground beneath the tail. Whatever the exact chain of hands through which the request passed, the practical work of a great supply organisation turned an idea into 7,000 physical objects, boxed and shipped and ready to be issued. And whatever the disputed details of names, the essential reality of the errand is not in doubt. Somewhere in the vast holding areas of southern England, in those tense weeks of late spring, the order was placed and the crickets were made. 7,000 small brass bodies stamped out on Birmingham machinery, 7,000 steel tongues riveted into place, 7,000 tinny clicks tested and boxed and crated and moved through the arteries of the army toward the airfields where the paratroopers waited. It is worth dwelling on the ordinariness of it. In a firm accustomed to filling orders for whistles and toys, a request came in for 7,000 clickers, and the workers on the line very likely had no notion of what they were making them for. They stamped the brass and set the steel as they had 1,000 times before, for children and band leaders and referees, and each little device that came off that line would soon cross the channel in the dark and land in a field in France, clutched in the fist of a boy who might live or die by the sound it made. There is something almost unbearable in that thought, the innocence of the object set against the weight of its purpose. A worker in Birmingham, filling what looked like an unremarkable novelty order, was in fact manufacturing the tools by which thousands of frightened men would try to keep from killing one another in the dark. The crickets came ashore in England and were gathered into the supply chain of the airborne divisions, and there they waited, in their crates, as the invasion drew near, as the men who would carry them trained and retrained, jumped and repacked their chutes, sharpened their knives, and wrote their letters home. The device was so simple, so foolproof, that there was almost nothing to teach about how it worked. A child could operate it. That was rather the point. But there was a great deal to teach about when to use it and how, and the officers of the airborne divisions understood that the cricket's value depended entirely on discipline, on every man knowing the protocol cold, so that in the terror and confusion of the drop no one would forget, no one would hesitate, no one would panic and click when he should stay silent or stay silent when a click might save him. Because for all its simplicity, the cricket carried a danger inside it. The commanders knew, and it weighed on them, that a signal this easy to reproduce could just as easily be turned against its makers. There was nothing secret about the sound. It was a common toy. If a German soldier captured a cricket from a dead or wounded paratrooper, and in the chaos of a scattered drop some certainly would, he had only to understand the pattern to use it. 1 click to lure a man in, 2 clicks to answer his challenge and draw him out of the dark trusting into a waiting rifle. The very thing that made the cricket brilliant, that it was cheap, simple, universal, was also the thing that made it perilous. The enemy could learn it in an afternoon. And so a hard rule was set. The crickets were to be used only during the initial phase of the invasion. The first 24 hours, the long night and the day that followed, the window in which the scattered paratroopers had to find one another and pull themselves into fighting units. After that, the device would be abandoned. The commanders feared rightly that the longer the crickets were in play, the greater the chance the Germans would capture them, understand them, and turn them into a trap. For one night only, the little brass toy would be trusted with men's lives. After that, it would be as worthless as the child's novelty it had always been. The crickets were issued shortly before June the 6th, pressed into the hands of the paratroopers in those last taut days, along with the maps and the ammunition, and the invasion money and the small anti-air sickness pills, along with all the accumulated freight of men going to war. A soldier would take the little brass thing, feel its weight in his palm, press the tab once or twice to hear the sound, and then tuck it away in a pocket or on a cord around his neck. Another object among the 100 objects a paratrooper carried. Most of them surely understood what it was for. Some of them perhaps still felt the strangeness of it, the memory of another cricket in another life, at the bottom of a Cracker Jack box or in the pocket of a childhood coat. The men of the 101st Airborne would carry them into Normandy. Whether the 82nd Airborne carried them too is a question the records themselves seem to argue over. Some accounts and later films place crickets in the hands of the 82nd's troopers, while the official histories of the 101st have long maintained that the little brass clickers were theirs alone, issued to their own men and to no others. The truth of who clicked in the dark that night may never be settled entirely, but this much is certain: on the night of the 5th of June, as the invasion fleet gathered and the great sky trains of transport aircraft warmed their engines on the runways of England, thousands of those little devices were tucked into thousands of pockets, riding toward France in the dark. And before those aircraft ever left the ground, there was one last thing the men had to hear, one last set of words, spoken by the jumpmasters in the roaring interiors of the transports, that would fix in every mind the rule on which so many lives would turn. To understand why a child's toy came to hold men's lives that night, you have to understand the shape of the thing they were being dropped into, the ground itself, and the plan that would deliver them onto it. The airborne piece of Operation Overlord was, on paper, an act of extraordinary ambition. 2 full American divisions, the 101st and the 82nd, more than 13,000 men, were to be lifted across the English Channel in a single night and delivered by parachute and glider onto the Cotentin Peninsula, behind the German coastal defences, hours before the seaborne assault crashed onto the beaches at dawn. Their task was to seize the exits behind Utah Beach, to hold the causeways across the flooded lowlands, to take the crossroads and the bridges and the villages that would decide whether the men coming ashore could break inland or be pinned against the sea and destroyed. It was a mission that depended on speed, on surprise, and above all on cohesion, on paratroopers landing together, gathering quickly and forming into fighting units before the enemy understood what had happened. That was the plan. What actually happened to it, from almost the first minute over France, was ruin. The trouble began with the weather and the terrain and the enemy all conspiring at once. The transport formations, flying without lights and without radio, ran into thick banks of cloud as they crossed the peninsula. Pilots who had trained to hold tight, disciplined formations suddenly could not see the aircraft beside them. Some climbed to escape the murk, some dove beneath it, some scattered sideways to avoid collision, and then, as the clouds thinned, the anti-aircraft fire came up to meet them, tracers rising in slow, deceptively lazy arcs, before whipping past at terrible speed, bursting flak that rocked the aircraft and threw men against the fuselage walls. Pilots jinked and swerved and pushed their throttles forward, and the neat serials that had crossed the channel like a river of aircraft came apart into fragments. The consequence fell on the men in the doors. Paratroopers who were meant to land in tight clusters on marked drop zones instead spilled out across roughly 40 miles of Norman countryside, some far from where they should have been, some miles from any comrade, some drowned in the flooded fields the Germans had deliberately created by damming the rivers, some hung in trees, some dead before they reached the ground. When the last man of a scattered stick landed and cut himself free of his harness, he often found himself utterly alone in the dark, with no idea where he was, no idea where the rest of his stick had come down, and no idea whether the next shape he saw would be a friend or an enemy. And the ground itself made that uncertainty worse than it had any right to be. The Cotentin was bocage country, a landscape shaped over centuries by farmers who had divided their land into small irregular fields, each one enclosed by a hedgerow. But the word hedgerow does the Norman bocage no justice at all. These were not the tidy garden hedges of an English lane. They were earthen banks built up over generations, sometimes 3 feet high and sometimes 15, packed hard and rooted through with a tangled growth of hundreds of years. Brambles, saplings, trees whose trunks had thickened into the mound until earth and wood were one thing. Atop each bank grew a dense crown of vegetation, so that the whole formed a rampart taller than a man, and often too thick to see through or climb over without effort. Between these ramparts ran the sunken lanes and the field edges, narrow corridors of blackness, walled on both sides, roofed by the overhanging branches, where at night the darkness was near absolute. A man standing in one of these corridors could not see the field on the other side of the bank. He could not see 15 feet in front of him. He could hear the rustle of movement, the scrape of a boot, a whispered word, but he could not see, and in that blindness every sound became a question with only 2 possible answers, and one of them was death. This was the maze into which 13,000 men were falling, a crazy quilt of small fields, each an isolated black room, connected by black corridors filled with strangers. Some of those strangers were German soldiers moving to their alarm positions. Some were American paratroopers as lost and frightened as the man listening for them. And there was no reliable way to tell one from the other by sight. A helmet silhouette at 15 feet in the dark told you nothing you could bet your life on. A challenge shouted aloud told the whole hedgerow where you were. Even the spoken password, flash, thunder, welcome, required a man to raise his voice into that listening dark and to trust that the answer, if it came in German-accented English, would give the enemy away before the enemy's rifle gave him away first. The cricket answered a problem that had no other good answer. It made no light, nothing to draw a sniper's eye across a field. It required no voice, nothing to carry a man's position and his nationality to every ear within 100 yards. And it made almost no sound at all, a small, dry, mechanical click, sharp and brief, distinctive enough to be recognised and quiet enough to die within a few feet of the hand that made it. In a landscape built for ambush, in a night built for confusion, it was the one signal a man could send that asked a question without shouting his own name to the enemy. That was the whole of its genius. It was not clever. It was not secret. It was simply the smallest possible way to say I am here. Are you a friend? In a place where saying anything at all could get you killed. The men who would carry it into that maze spent their last hours in England learning exactly how. At the airfields scattered across the southern counties, at Greenham Common, where the men of the 101st staged, at Membury, at Merrifield and the others, the paratroopers gathered in the long evening light of June the 5th for the final briefings. They had been sealed into their marshalling areas for days already, cut off from the outside world behind wire and guards, studying sand table models of the Norman countryside and memorising the shapes of villages they had never seen. They knew the names, Stemer-Église, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, Carentan, the way a man knows the streets of a town he has walked in dreams. Now, in these last hours, the jumpmasters gathered their sticks and went over the things that could not be written down and carried, the things that had to live in a man's reflexes. Among them was the cricket, and the rule was simple enough to be spoken in a single breath and drilled until it was instinct. 1 click challenges, 2 clicks answer. If you hear a stir in the dark and you do not know who made it, you press the cricket once, a single, deliberate click, and then you wait. If the shape in the dark is a friend, it will answer with 2 clicks, close together, and you may go forward. If 2 clicks do not come, then whatever is out there is not one of yours, and you must act on that knowledge with your weapon or with silence, whichever the moment demands. But the jumpmasters gave them more than the bare protocol, because the bare protocol was not enough to keep a man alive. There were refinements, hard-won and carefully taught. Hold the cricket inside a closed fist when you press it, so that the flesh of your hand muffles the sound and it carries only as far as it must, far enough for the man you're challenging to hear, not so far that it announces you to the whole field. Do not use it in open ground, where you have no cover and where the sound might reach ears you never intended to reach, and never, this above all, use it twice from the same position. A single click answered, and you move. Because the cricket that could find a friend could also draw an enemy, and a man who clicked twice from the same patch of hedgerow was a man telling anyone who was listening exactly where to point a rifle. The device that saved you if you used it right could kill you if you used it lazily. The margin between the two was a matter of feet and seconds and discipline. They listened, these young men, in the failing light of the English evening. Among them were the troopers of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment and the 501st, and, whatever the records would later argue, men of the 82nd's 505th as well, all of them absorbing the last instructions before the last supper before the jump. Some of them were 19 years old. Many had never been in combat. They had trained for months, for years, for a thing they could not fully imagine, and now the thing was upon them, close enough to touch, close enough that a man could look at his watch and count the hours he had left in England. It is one of the strange truths of that night that so much of the fear was quiet. The men did not for the most part rage or weep. They did the small human things that men do at the edge of great danger. They wrote letters home, careful, guarded letters, because the censors would read them, letters that could not say where they were going or what they were about to do, and so said instead the ordinary things, the I am fine, don't worry, Give my love to everyone, things that meant, underneath, this may be the last time I write to you. They shook hands. Officers who had led these men through the long grind of training found themselves, in these last hours, making solemn little speeches, the kind of words a man reaches for when he knows some of the faces in front of him will not come home and cannot say so, and so says something about duty and about pride and about seeing one another on the other side. Handshakes passed down the lines of men. Some of them prayed, some of them slept or pretended to. Some of them checked and rechecked their equipment with the obsessive care of men who had nothing left to do but wait, and who could not bear to simply wait. And in among the maps and the ammunition and the rations and the reserve chutes and the leg bags stuffed until they could barely be lifted, each man carried the little brass cricket, a thing that weighed nothing, that had cost a few cents to make, and that had, in the last few days, become as much a part of the invasion as the rifle in his hands. Some of them pressed it once in the dark of the tent, just to hear the click again, to fix the sound in their ears against the moment they would need it. It was a small, dry, absurdly ordinary noise. It was the sound of a children's party, of a novelty toy, of a thing that belonged to a world of safety and peace and Sunday afternoons. And it was riding to France in the pockets of men who might within hours be dead. Then the light went out of the English sky, and it was time. The paratroopers loaded in the last of the dusk and the first of the dark, filing out to the waiting aircraft in the long shuffling procession that the equipment forced upon them. A fully loaded paratrooper could barely walk. He carried his main parachute and his reserve, his weapon broken down and stowed or slung ready, grenades, ammunition, a knife, rations for days, and often a leg bag lashed to his lower leg carrying still more. Mines, radios, mortar rounds, whatever the mission demanded. Men who could not climb the short ladder into the C-47 unaided were pushed and hauled aboard by their comrades and by the crews, folded into the metal bench seats that ran down both sides of the fuselage, packed in so tightly that their knees interlocked with the men across from them, their overloaded bodies pressed together in the narrow tube of the aircraft. The interiors glowed a dull red. It was a deliberate thing. Red light preserves a man's night vision, so that when the door opened onto the darkness over France, his eyes would already be adjusted to the dark. In that red half-light, the men sat in their rows, faces blacked with burnt cork and cocoa and cooking oil, some with their heads shaved to strips in a rough imitation of a Mohawk war paint and war haircuts that turned boys from Ohio and Texas and New York into something that looked, in the red glow, like a company of the damned. The jumpmasters, the men who would stand in the open door and lead each stick out into the night, moved down the fuselage doing the last equipment checks, tugging at harnesses, checking static line hooks, leaning close to shout over the noise into the ear of a man who could not hear a word spoken at conversational volume, because the noise, once the engines turned over, was enormous. The twin engines of the C-47 filled the aircraft with a roar that made speech nearly impossible, a vibration that came up through the metal floor and into the bones. Over 800 of these aircraft were making that same noise across the airfields of southern England, a great mechanical thunder rising in the dark, the sound of the largest airborne assault the world had yet attempted assembling itself for takeoff. The serials began to roll around 11 o'clock on the night of June the 5th. Aircraft after aircraft turned onto the runways and pushed their throttles forward and lumbered into the sky under their crushing loads, and then began the slow, patient, dangerous work of forming up. Hundreds of aircraft in darkness, without radio, without lights, except the dim formation lamps, sliding into their assigned places in the great columns that would fly the route across the channel. It was a feat of navigation and nerve that few outside the aircrews ever appreciated. 800 transports finding their positions in the black sky over the water, flying wingtip to wingtip in the dark, holding the formation on which everything depended, all in silence. Below them, the channel was full of ships. The invasion fleet was already moving, the greatest armada ever assembled, thousands of vessels crossing toward the Norman coast, and the paratroopers, when they could see anything at all through the small windows, could sometimes make out the dark water sliding past beneath the wings and, here and there, the wake of the ships below. Mostly, though, there was nothing to see. There was the red-lit interior, the packed rows of painted faces, the roar of the engines and the knowledge settling into every man that the ground beneath them was no longer England. In one of those aircraft, riding with the 2nd Battalion Headquarters Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, was a private first class named David Kenyon Webster, A young man from a comfortable Eastern family, a Harvard student who had left the security of that world to volunteer for the Paratroopers, and who would one day become one of the most honest chroniclers of what he saw. Webster was a watcher and a writer, a man who noticed things and set them down plainly, and on this night, looking out from the aircraft as it droned toward France, what he noticed was the water. All I could see was water, he remembered. Miles and miles of water. And then, in the same breath, the sentence that captured the whole condition of every man in every one of those 800 aircraft, the sentence that closed the door on any other possibility. But this was D-Day, and nobody went back to England. Nobody went back. That was the truth of it. Whatever a man felt in those last minutes over the Channel, and men felt everything, terror and exhilaration, and a strange calm and a desperate wish to be anywhere else, there was no going back. The aircraft would not turn around. The mission would not be recalled. The only way out of the C-47 was through the door into the dark over France. A man could refuse to jump, a very few did, but even that would not carry him home. It would only carry him back across the Channel in shame to a war that would find him again. For all practical purposes, the choice had been made days ago, weeks ago, the day each man raised his hand and volunteered for the Airborne, and the extra pay, and the boots, and the reputation, and there was nothing left now but to ride it out and go when the light turned green. Somewhere along the route, the green coast of France came up out of the dark, or rather, the darkness where the coast should be, marked by the pale line of surf and then by something worse. As the aircraft crossed from the sea onto the peninsula, they flew into the cloud bank that would break their formations, and almost at once the anti-aircraft fire began to rise. To the men inside, packed and blind, it announced itself first as sound, a rattling against the fuselage like gravel thrown against a tin roof, and then the heavier thumps of nearby bursts that shook the aircraft and tilted the floor beneath their boots. Through the door and the windows they could see it now. The tracers climbing, the flak blooming in the dark, the whole enemy ground below coming awake and reaching up for them. Some of the aircraft were hit, some caught fire and went down with their sticks still aboard, and the pilots, who had held such disciplined formations across the water, now began the desperate business of survival, climbing, diving, banking away from the fire, and the columns dissolved. For the men standing hooked up in the doors, the world had become chaos before they ever left the aircraft. The green light would come at the wrong moment or the wrong place, or with the aircraft flying too fast and too low or too high, and the jumpmaster would go and the stick would go behind him, tumbling out into the tracer-streaked night, and the wind would take them, and the ground would come up hard and unfamiliar, and each man would land alone in a black field walled with earthen banks, in a country he had only ever seen on a sand table, miles very likely from where he was meant to be, miles very likely from the nearest friendly face. And in that moment, cut free of his chute, crouched against the base of a hedgerow with his heart hammering, listening to the alien dark, each man would reach, with a hand that was perhaps not entirely steady, for the small brass thing in his pocket, the little toy from Birmingham, the 5-cent cricket. Everything the commanders had feared and everything they had hoped was about to be tested, not in a briefing tent or a training field, but in the actual black corridors of the Norman bocage, where the shapes moving 15 feet away were real and armed and might be anyone at all. The rule that had been drilled into every man, 1 click, answer 2, was about to meet the reality it had been made for. And the first of those clicks was already about to sound in the dark, from the hand of a frightened, lost and utterly determined man into a silence that would either answer him or betray him. It began at altitude, in the last minutes before the jump, with the mathematics of the drop quietly coming undone. The plan had been drawn to the yard. 900 aircraft and more moving in tight 9-plane Vs were to cross the west coast of the Cotentin, hold their heading for a handful of minutes, throttle back to 110 miles an hour, descend to 600 feet, and put their sticks over drop zones marked by pathfinders with lights and radar beacons. At that speed and that altitude, a stick of 18 men would land in a rough line a few hundred yards long, close enough that the first man down could still hear the last, close enough to gather in the dark and become a unit again within the hour. That was the plan. The peninsula had other arrangements. The cloud bank came first, a wall of grey vapour sitting over the landmass where the maps had promised open sky, and the formations flew into it blind. Pilots who a moment before had held station on the green wingtip lights of the plane beside them now saw nothing at all. No horizon, no wingman, no ground. The instinct of a man flying a heavy transport into a cloud he cannot see through is to make room, to peel away from the aircraft he knows is somewhere close, and so the Vs began to spread. Some climbed, some dove. When they broke out the far side of the cloud, the neat columns had become a scattering of single aircraft, groping for a coastline they could no longer recognise, and then the flak found them. The German gunners on the Cottontan were awake and ready, and they poured it up in sheets. Tracers rose in slow curving arcs that seemed almost lazy until they whipped past the windows at their true speed. The bursts of the heavier guns walked across the sky, and each one was a decision forced on a pilot who had never been shot at while carrying 18 men he could not manoeuvre freely to protect. Some firewalled their throttles and pushed the airspeed well past the 110 they were meant to hold. Some hauled back on the yokes and climbed, seeking the false safety of altitude. Some dropped low to get under the fire, and when the green light came on over the drop zones, or over what the navigators hoped were the drop zones, the men went out into all of it, too fast so that the opening shock of the canopy could snap a leg or tear equipment away, too high so that a trooper drifted for long minutes as a target, too low so that the chute barely had time to blossom before the ground arrived. The arithmetic that had promised a stick landing in a tidy line now produced men strung across the countryside like seed flung from a fast hand. Some sticks came down across 15 miles of Norman ground. A man who jumped third might land a valley away from the man who jumped fourth. Whole plane loads went down miles from any drop zone, into terrain no one had briefed them on because no one had expected them to be there. Approximately 13,100 American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had launched into this. They had trained for months to seize the causeways behind Utah Beach, the bridges over the Murderate and the Douve, the crossroads town of Sainte-Mère-Église that sat astride the road the Germans would use to counterattack. The plan had depended on cohesion, on men landing together and moving together toward objectives they had memorized. The peninsula took the cohesion away in the first 10 minutes and handed each man instead the countryside itself, dark, walled, flooded in places, and full of an enemy who was now thoroughly awake. For many of the 82nd, the ground that came up was not ground at all. The Germans had flooded the low bottoms of the Murderer River as a deliberate defence against exactly this kind of landing, and from 600 feet in the dark the flooded meadows looked like solid fields. The same flat pale sheen, the same suggestion of grass, indistinguishable from a pasture. Men of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment came down into water they could not see until they were in it. Water 2 and 3 and 4 feet deep in a maze of reeds and drainage ditches, and some of them never came up. A paratrooper on the night of June 6th carried something close to his own body weight in equipment. A reserve chute, a main weapon, ammunition, grenades, rations, entrenching tools, sometimes a mine or a mortar round strapped to a leg bag. A man dropped into deep water in that load, with a canopy collapsing over him and the risers wrapped around his limbs, had seconds to cut himself free, and in the blackness, feeling for the small knife in his boot or the shroud lines across his chest, some of them ran out of seconds. They drowned in a foot and a half of water because they could not find the surface, or could not shed the weight, or could not tell which way was up. It was among the cruelest deaths of the entire invasion, and it happened silently in the dark to men who had survived the flak only to be killed by a flooded meadow. Others of the 82nd came down inside Sainte-Mère-Église itself, into the streets and gardens and rooftops of a town that was at that hour wide awake. A building had caught fire earlier in the night, and the townspeople had been turned out by the Germans to fight it, a bucket line working under armed guard in the town square while the church bell rang the alarm. Into that lit, populated space paratroopers began to descend, swinging down into the light of the burning house, exposed, drifting toward a square full of enemy soldiers with their weapons already in their hands. Some were shot in their harnesses before they reached the ground. Some came down on the steep slate roofs and slid off into the streets, and in isolated, almost unbelievable instances, men of the 101st dropped too far to the east, went into the English Channel itself, and vanished under the weight of their own gear before they could inflate anything that would hold them up. This was the shape of the disaster into which the first American landed alone at roughly 1 o'clock in the morning. Picture him, A single man in a black field somewhere on the Cotentin, no idea precisely where. The sound of the aircraft that carried him already fading to the south, the flak still climbing miles away. Around him, earthen banks 8 and 10 feet high, topped with hedges grown thick over centuries, so that the field is a room with walls he cannot see over. He does not know if the men who jumped before and after him are 200 yards away or 2 miles. He does not know if the shape at the far corner of the field is a cow, a fence post, or a German. He has a rifle or a carbine broken down in a padded case, and it may take him minutes to assemble it. He has a knife and grenades and a pistol. And he has, in a pocket of his jacket, a small stamped brass toy from a factory in Birmingham, a thing that cost about 5 cents, a thing that makes exactly one sound. In a countryside that had just swallowed his entire division into fragments, that little clicker was, for the moment, the only tool he owned that could turn a stranger in the dark into a friend. Everything else he carried could kill, only the cricket could gather. The first minutes on the ground had a rhythm all their own, and every man who survived them described it in nearly the same terms. The landing itself, hard and disorienting, a slam of impact and then the immediate overriding problem of the canopy. A great pale sheet that would not fall obediently, but caught whatever breeze there was and dragged, and had to be spilled and hauled in, and above all hidden, because a parachute spread white across a dark field in the coming dawn was a signpost that said an American came down here. So the first thing a trooper did, before he had caught his breath, was fight the chute, punch the quick release, gather the billowing silk in both arms, stuff it under a hedge or into a ditch or beneath the nearest cover, working by feel, his heart going so hard he could hear it. Then the harness, unbuckled and shrugged off. Then the weapon, assembled with fingers that fumbled the familiar motions because the dark and the fear made everything strange. Then, crouched at the base of a bank, the taking of stock. What do I have? Where am I? Am I alone? And here the memoirs are unanimous about the sensory world these men landed into, because it was so unlike anything they had rehearsed. They had trained in England and America on daylight fields and in mock villages. Now they were in Norman farm country in the small hours, and the first thing many of them noticed, absurdly, was the smell, the rich, wet, faintly manured smell of turned earth and old pasture, the particular odour of the bocage, a smell some of them would associate with terror for the rest of their lives. The second thing was the cattle. The Norman fields were full of dairy cows, and the cows had been startled by the aircraft and the gunfire, and they moved in the dark, big shapes shifting against the hedges, breathing and chewing, and more than one paratrooper nearly fired at a cow, or froze rigid at the sound of a large body moving toward him, only to have it resolve into a curious heifer. The lowing of cattle became, that night, one of the constant sounds of the invasion, an incongruous pastoral note under the flak, and then, beneath and around all of it, the thing the men remembered most, the silence. The engines of the C-47s faded south and were gone, and the flak, once a man had drifted away from the drop zone, grew distant, and what was left was an enormous, pressing quiet, the quiet of a farming country at 1 in the morning, broken only by the cows, the wind in the hedge tops, the far-off mutter of guns. Into that silence a man's own smallest movement seemed to shout. The snap of a twig underfoot was an explosion. The click of a rifle bolt could be heard, it felt, for a mile. And in that silence the terrible logic of the cricket became not a briefing point, but a physical fact in the chest. To find another American, you had to make a noise first. You had to break the silence yourself, deliberately, with a sharp metallic sound that would carry across the field to whatever was out there. And whatever was out there might answer with 2 clicks, or might answer with a rifle. Above the town of Stemer-Église, one man was learning the meaning of that silence in a way no one else on the peninsula quite shared. Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne, had drifted over the square in the light of the burning house, and as he came down his canopy had caught on a pinnacle of the church tower, and there it had held. He hung against the stone of the steeple, suspended above the fighting, his parachute snagged on the spire, unable to climb up and unable to cut himself free without falling into the square, below where German soldiers were shooting at the men descending around him. He had been hit in the foot, and so he did the only thing left to a man in his position. He went limp and played dead, hanging in his harness against the cold stone while the battle he could not join raged beneath his boots. The bell of the church, he later said, rang so close to his ear that it deafened him. He hung there for roughly 2 hours, feigning death, watching by the light of the fire as men of his own division were killed in the streets below, unable to reach for any cricket, unable to answer any click, the most exposed and most helpless man in the entire airborne assault. His silence was not a choice made to find friends. It was a performance staged to survive an enemy who was quite literally all around and beneath him. Elsewhere in the dark, other men of the 505th were coming down into ground that would define the next several days of fighting. Near a stone causeway over the flooded Murderet, at a place called La Fière, scattered troopers were gathering into a defence that would hold one of the essential crossings of the whole American sector. Sergeant William Owens of the 505th was among the men who would make that stand, a stand that would earn him the Distinguished Service Cross for the way he held the line at the bridge against German armour and infantry when the position seemed certain to be overrun. But that came later, in daylight, after the gathering. In the first hours it was the same for him as for all of them, a lone man, or 2 men, or 3, feeling their way along the base of a hedgerow, listening, deciding, and confronting the same essential problem the cricket had been made to solve. How do I know that the shape ahead of me in the dark is one of mine, before one of us fires? The first clicks began to sound across the cotton town within the first hour, thin and sharp and small against the enormous night. A man would hear something, a footfall, the rustle of equipment, the scrape of a boot on the sunken lane, the click of another man's cricket carried faintly across a field, and he would ease the little brass toy out of his pocket, close his fist around it the way the jumpmasters had drilled to muffle it and to keep from being caught with it clearly in view, and he would press the tongue once. One click, a single sharp clack into the dark, and then the longest silence of his life, a second or 2 that stretched into something unbearable, while he waited to hear whether the answer would be 2 clicks or a bullet. Paratrooper John Houston of the 101st landed and, in those first minutes, heard movement near a hedgerow, the sound of a body shifting in the dark, close, unidentifiable. He had every reason to believe it could be German. The country was full of them. The enemy garrison had been roused. The shape in the hedge could just as easily be a rifleman waiting for him to reveal himself. But the cricket existed precisely for this moment, and Houston used it. He clicked once, and out of the hedgerow came the answer he had been trained to hope for. 2 clicks, clean and unmistakable, the reply that meant American. He was joined by 2 other men who had been waiting in the same dark, each as lost and as frightened as he was, and the 3 of them, strangers a moment before, became a unit. In the hours that followed they moved together and gathered others, 1 click and 2 clicks at a time, until Houston's little scratch force numbered 15 men, 15 soldiers assembled out of the scattered wreckage of the drop by nothing more elaborate than a 5-cent toy, and a rule everyone had memorized. That was the cricket working exactly as its makers had intended, and the relief in it was a physical thing. Men described the sound of 2 answering clicks in language usually reserved for far grander deliverances. General Maxwell Taylor, the commander of the 101st, who had done so much to put the crickets into his men's pockets, came down that night as scattered as any private, and he too found himself alone in the dark with a decision to make. He would remember it precisely. A pistol in one hand and the cricket in the other, and then, out of the blackness, the answer. "I heard the click," he said. "That was the most pleasant sound I ever heard in the entire war." A major general who had commanded thousands and would command more, reduced by the Norman night to the same condition as the youngest replacement in his division, a man alone in a field listening for a toy to tell him he was not alone. When the answer came, it was, in his own words, the most pleasant sound of the whole war. There is no better measure of what the cricket meant that night than that a general and a private would describe the same 2 clicks in the same terms. But for every click that was answered, there were clicks that fell into nothing. This was the other face of the device, the one the after-action reports and the veterans' interviews returned to again and again, and it was the crueler face. A trooper down alone would hear something in the dark, or hear nothing at all and simply need to know whether the field held friends, and he would press the cricket once, and the silence would come back unbroken. No answering clicks, only the cows and the wind and the distant guns. And now he was in a worse position than before, because he had made a noise. He had announced into a countryside full of enemy soldiers that here, in this field, was an American with a signalling device. A device the Germans, if they overheard enough of them, might come to understand. The single click that summoned a friend also drew a line straight back to the man who made it. So the lone trooper in the silence faced a decision the cricket forced on him and could not resolve. Should he click again? A second click might reach a friend who had simply not heard the first, who was 2 hedgerows over and had missed the thin sound under the wind. But a second click also doubled his exposure, doubled the chance that the wrong ears had located him, and violated the very rule the jumpmasters had pounded into him. Never click twice from the same spot, because a man who clicks twice from one place teaches whatever is listening exactly where to aim. Or should he move? Abandon the spot, slip along the base of the hedge to a new position, and try again from somewhere the sound could not be traced back to. Moving was its own risk. Moving meant noise, meant crossing open ground, meant possibly walking straight into the thing he was trying to avoid. Every option was a gamble, and the stakes on all of them were the same. Men made the calculation in seconds, alone, with no one to consult and no way to know if they were choosing right, and the choice they made determined whether they lived to see the gathering that dawn would bring. That was the fundamental tension the cricket carried into the bocage, the paradox stamped into 5 cents of Birmingham brass. It was, at the same instant, a plea and an exposure, a hand extended into the dark toward a friend, and a target painted on the man who extended it. To use it was to gamble that the ears out there were American. To refuse to use it was to stay alone, and alone, in that country on that night, was its own slow death sentence for a scattered army that could accomplish nothing until it came back together. The whole airborne plan, shattered in the first 10 minutes over the peninsula, now depended on thousands of individual men making that gamble over and over across 40 miles of hedgerow. Click, wait, reassembling a Division 1 answered signal at a time, while the enemy learned hour by hour what the little clicking sound meant. The cricket had been made for exactly this, and now, in the actual dark, with real men crouched at the base of real banks and real Germans moving in the lanes, the true test was only beginning, because it was one thing to click into an empty silence, and quite another to click when the shape moving toward you had heard you first, and was already deciding what to do about the sound. Somewhere in the fields west of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, a 53-year-old Major General was crawling on his hands and knees along the base of a hedgerow, a pistol in one hand and a 5-cent toy in the other, and he had never in his life been more alone. Maxwell Davenport Taylor commanded the 101st Airborne Division, 14,000 men on paper, a self-contained instrument of war built to seize the exits behind Utah Beach, and at that moment, somewhere near 1:30 in the morning of June 6, 1944, he commanded exactly no one. He had come down clean, his chute had opened, the ground had come up out of the dark, and he had landed hard in a Norman field with the whole of his division scattered across 40 miles of countryside he could not see. Around him there were no staff cars, no radio net, no tent with map boards and coffee, and the low murmur of a headquarters at work. There was a hedge, there was a field, there was the wet smell of grass and manure and the far-off stutter of guns, and there was the cricket, warm now from the grip of his hand. This was the device operating at precisely the scale its designers had imagined, not a battlefield system, not a network. A handshake in the dark, one man to one man, performed with a toy that a child in Birmingham might have carried in his pocket. Taylor had championed this thing. He had pushed for its adoption after Sicily, when the passwords had failed and the drops had gone wrong, and men had shot at shapes because no one had a better way to know a friend from a stranger in the black. Now the general who had bet on the cricket was staking his own life on it, crawling through the bocage with the little brass clicker held ready, testing his own theory against the actual dark. He moved the way every trooper that night was moving, or trying to move, low, slow, hugging the earthen banks where the shadows were deepest, pausing at every rustle to listen with his whole body. The hedgerows made a maze of the country. Each field was a room walled in on all 4 sides by banks of packed earth, 8 and 10 feet high, grown over with hawthorn and bramble, and to pass from one room to the next, you had to find the gate or the gap, and the gate was exactly where an enemy would wait. Taylor found a gate. He crept toward it, and on the far side of it, in the dark he could not penetrate, something stirred. He drew his pistol, he got all set. Whatever was there was close now, close enough to hear, and in the space of a breath the whole calculus of the night narrowed to a single question with only two answers, and one of them was death. And then, out of the black came the sound. One click. The thin metallic snap of spring steel against brass. Unmistakable. The sound he had heard demonstrated in a hangar in England. The sound he had ordered stamped out 7,000 times in a Birmingham workshop. He answered. 2 clicks. And the shape on the other side of the gate resolved into an American paratrooper, and the pistol went down, and Maxwell Taylor had his first man. That was the most pleasant sound, he would say for the rest of his life, that he ever heard in the entire war. Not the guns of the fleet, not the roar of his own aircraft. A toy clicking once in the dark on the other side of a hedge, telling him he was no longer alone. From that single answered click the division began, impossibly, to rebuild itself. Taylor and the trooper moved on together, 2 men now instead of 1, and they clicked their way across the fields, and one by one the count grew. A man rose from a ditch. 2 more came out of an orchard. They found each other by the sound, always the sound. 1 click offered into the dark, 2 clicks returned, and another rifle added to the little band. But here was the thing that would become legend. The detail that told the truth about how completely the plan had come apart. The men Maxwell Taylor gathered around him in those first hours were not, most of them, the men a general needs on the first morning of an invasion. They were staff officers. They were clerks. They were, some of them, cooks. The scatter had been so total, so indifferent to rank and role, that the commanding general of an airborne division assembled a headquarters element out of whoever the wind and the flak had thrown down within cricket range of him. Men trained to run supply and plan operations and feed a division, now clutching rifles in the hedgerows, following their general toward objectives none of them could yet see. Taylor is said to have moved through that gathering crowd of specialists and support men, and asked, half in wonder, where his infantry was, because for a long time he had found nearly everyone but a combat trooper. Never, the story goes, had so few been commanded by so many. But they were together. That was the point the cricket made again and again across the black fields that night. Together was everything. A single paratrooper in a Normandy field was a casualty waiting to happen. Cut off, blind, unable to accomplish any mission that mattered, hunted by an enemy who knew the ground and moved on it with confidence. 2 paratroopers were a fire team, 20 were a threat. And the only bridge from 1 to 20, in the absence of radios and daylight and the tidy sticks that had been shredded over the peninsula, was the little clicking sound passing from hedge to hedge, gathering the invasion back into itself one recognition at a time. Taylor's band swelled through the small hours, staff and cooks and at last real infantry, men of the fighting regiments who had come down within reach, until the general who had landed alone had something like a force around him, a ragged, improvised, cross-purposed force, but a force, and he turned it toward the causeways behind Utah and began to march. Across 40 miles of bocage, thousands of versions of that same scene were playing out in the dark. A man clicked, a man answered, 2 became 4. It was slow. It was terrifying. It worked more often than anyone had a right to expect, because the cricket did the one thing a password could not. It crossed the language line and the accent line and the fear line in a single fraction of a second, a sound so simple that a frightened man could produce it correctly, even with his hands shaking and his mouth too dry to speak. That was its genius, and Maxwell Taylor's night was its proof. The device built for exactly this had passed exactly this test, and yet the very thing that made it work was the thing that made it deadly, because the cricket carried no secret in it. A password could be forgotten by the man who forgot it. The sound of a cricket could be understood by anyone who heard it enough times and thought about what it meant. And the Germans, that night, were listening. The fear had a shape, and the shape was this, a returned 2-click answer that came not from a friend but from an enemy who had learned the trick. Commanders had seen it coming before the drop. It was, in fact, the whole reason the crickets were authorized for only the first 24 hours. The planners understood from the start that the device's value had a shelf life measured in a single day, because after that the enemy would have captured enough of them, or overheard enough of them, to turn the signal inside out. A cricket taken from a dead paratrooper was a working cricket. A German soldier who had heard the pattern a few times in the lanes, 1 click then 2, could count. He could wait in a ditch with a clicker of his own, or with a captured one, and when a lone American's challenge came thin across the dark, he could answer it. 2 clicks. "Come here, friend. Come toward the sound." And the trooper, aching for exactly that answer, hungry for it after an hour alone in enemy country, would rise from his cover and move toward the friend who was not a friend at all. This is the turn the whole story bends around, the moment when the tool that saved lives began to cost them, because now every answered click was ambiguous. Before, the silence had been the terror, the click offered, and nothing coming back. But an answer could be worse than silence, because an answer pulled you forward. An answer made you stand and move and expose yourself, trusting the sound, and the sound could lie. The cricket had been issued to end the fear of the dark, to replace the paralysis of not knowing with a clean binary, friend or not friend, decided in an instant. Instead, once the rumour spread that the Germans had crickets too, it introduced a third state that was worse than either of the first two, the answered signal you could not trust. Now the trooper who clicked and heard 2 clicks back faced a fresh calculation, as cruel as the one the silence had forced on him. Was that a comrade 2 hedges over, or a man in field grey waiting behind a rifle for him to walk into the open? The accounts of what followed are, it must be said honestly, a tangle of testimony and legend, and the historian owes the dead the discipline of saying so. The single most famous rendering of that night, the great published account that fixed D-Day in the popular imagination for generations, the one that gave the airborne drop its indelible imagery, describes scenes in which men were killed after a clicker sounded, drawn toward an answer that turned out to be a trap, or shot because a nervous trooper heard the metallic snap of a rifle bolt and mistook it for the friendly click, or made the click himself and was answered by fire. Veterans, decades later, would tell interviewers versions of the same thing. The man who clicked and heard the answer and went toward it and did not come back, the shape that clicked twice and then opened up, the terrible discovery that the sound you had staked your life on could be worn by the enemy like a stolen coat. What the verified after-action reports will bear out precisely is harder to pin down. Widespread, documented, systematic German use of captured crickets does not survive cleanly in the record, but the fear of it was real, immediate and universal, and in the country of the bocage that night, fear was itself a kind of fact. A man does not need proof that the Germans have crickets to be paralysed by the possibility that they might. He needs only to have heard it whispered by the man beside him, or to have thought of it himself in the long minutes alone, and thereafter every answered click carried a shadow. Consider what that did to the men. The metallic snap of a rifle bolt drawn back is not, to the untrained ear in the black, entirely unlike the snap of spring steel against brass. In the flooded, hedge-walled dark, sounds lost their edges. A trooper crouched at the base of a bank, straining every nerve, might hear a click and answer it and start forward, or might hear a bolt and take it for a click and rise and be wrong in the worst way a man can be wrong. And the enemy, for his part, had learned that this particular strange clicking sound meant Americans nearby, which meant that a trooper who clicked into an occupied field had not necessarily lured a false answer. He might simply have told a German patrol in the plainest possible terms that here was a paratrooper worth hunting. The sound cut both ways and every way. It was a plea for friendship that doubled as a confession of position. The device that had been designed to dissolve the terror of the dark had, by the deep hours of the night, redistributed that terror into something more insidious. Not the fear of the unknown, but the fear of the known signal that could no longer be trusted. And so a strange, wary silence began to spread through parts of the bocage as the night wore on. Men who had clicked freely in the first hour grew cautious. Some stopped clicking altogether and relied on other tests, a whispered challenge if they were close enough, a demand for the countersign, a name shouted low. Some clicked once and then went utterly still, refusing to move toward any answer, letting the other man come to them so that they, and not the answerer, controlled the meeting. The protocol the jump masters had drilled, 1 click, answer 2, never twice from the same spot, was already mutating under the pressure of real fear into 100 improvised local versions, each man's private amendment to a plan that had contact with reality for only a few hours and had already begun to bend. That was the countryside, scattered, blind, every meeting a gamble. But there was a place where the cricket worked the way it was meant to, and that place was a town. Sainte-Mère-Église sat astride the main road that ran up the spine of the Cotentin Peninsula, the N13, the artery the Germans would use to feed reinforcements toward the beaches. Whoever held Sainte-Mère-Église held the road, and holding the road was worth a great deal on the morning of an invasion. It fell to the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne, and to the 3rd Battalion of that regiment in particular, and to the battalion's commander, a hard driving officer named Edward Krauss, whom his men called Cannonball. Before the jump, before the C-47s lifted off from England into the dark, Krauss had gathered his men and told them, in the flat certainty of a man who has already decided how the night will end, that no matter where in France they landed, they were to march on the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, where together they would liberate the people and fly the flag from the tallest building in town. He was carrying that flag. It was, the story holds, the same flag his regiment had flown over Naples. He meant to raise it again over the first French town freed on D-Day. The disputed history sits awkwardly here, and it deserves to be named rather than smoothed over. The official line of the 101st Airborne held and holds that the cricket was theirs alone, issued to the Screaming Eagles, procured in those 7,000 units, briefed into their jumpmaster's final instructions and no one else's. But the men of the 82nd told a different story, and so did some of the historians who interviewed them, including the author of that great published account of the invasion. In their telling, crickets found their way into 82nd hands too, carried by 505th troopers into the fields around Sainte-Mère-Église, clicked in the town's streets and its surrounding lanes through the long hours of the fight. Whether that was official issue or informal sharing, whether it was every man or only some, the record does not settle cleanly, and an honest telling leaves the seam showing. What the veterans of the town's capture described was a night in which the little clicking sound did its work, and did it, in the town, better than it did anywhere in the open country beyond. Krauss got into Sainte-Mère-Église in the small hours with a fraction of his battalion. The scatter had taken its cut of the 505th, as it had taken its cut of everyone, but with enough, and with a local Frenchman to guide him around the German positions and in through the town's edge. And here is where the two faces of the cricket showed themselves most sharply, side by side in a single stretch of country. Inside the town, among men who knew the plan, who had a named objective and a commander pulling them toward it, and a shared understanding of where friends were supposed to be, the cricket was reliable. A trooper moving down a dark street, hearing a footfall in a doorway, clicked once, and the answer came back too, and the two men joined and moved on together toward the church, toward the square, toward the tall building where the flag was going to fly. Discipline made the sound trustworthy. When you knew roughly where your friends were and what they were doing, an answered click confirmed what you already half expected, and the device did exactly what Maxwell Taylor had wanted it to do. It turned strangers in the dark into a fighting unit. Fast, without a word spoken. Krauss took the town. By 5 a.m, Sainte-Mère-Église was in American hands, the first French town liberated on D-Day. The flag from Naples raised over it in the grey beginning of the light, just as Cannonball Krauss had promised his men before they ever left England. The M13 was cut. The 505th dug in to hold what it had taken, and it would hold it through counterattacks and shell fire in the hours and days to come. But the crossroads was theirs, and it stayed theirs. Step a few hundred yards past the last houses, though, out into the hedgerows that ring the town, and the cricket became a different device entirely. Out there, among the scattered men who had no idea where they were, and no idea where anyone else was, who had come down miles from any drop zone and were trying to find a war they had lost track of the moment their chutes opened. Out there the same brass clicker was a coin flip with a man's life on it. A dispersed trooper in those lanes clicked into a dark that gave back nothing, and he was alone with the calculation that had no good answer. Or he clicked and heard a snap in return and could not possibly tell, whether that snap was spring steel or a rifle bolt, a friend or the last sound he would hear. The town and the country were the same night, the same division, the same little brass toy, and the toy was salvation in one and a death sentence in the other, and the only difference between them was whether the men using it knew the plan. That was the truth the cricket taught in the fields around Sainte-Mère-Église, and it was a hard truth for the officers who had believed in the device to absorb. It was never really a technology at all. It was a social instrument. It worked in exact proportion to the cohesion of the men who held it. Where there was a unit, an intact chain of command, a shared objective, men who knew who was supposed to be where. The cricket amplified that cohesion, made it faster and quieter and safer, turned a scattered handful into a fist. Where there was no unit, where a man was truly alone in country he did not know among an enemy who did, the cricket amplified nothing, because there was nothing to amplify. It could only pass the recognition. It could not create the friend to be recognised. And so the device performed brilliantly for Cannonball Kraus in the streets of the first liberated town, and murderously for the lone man in the hedgerow 2 miles away. And both of those things were true at the same hour of the same morning, and the men who lived through it carried both memories for the rest of their lives. Maxwell Taylor, marching now toward the causeways with his improbable command of cooks and clerks and the combat men he had finally begun to find, still had his cricket in his hand. He would keep clicking through the dark, gathering men, and the sound would keep saving him. But even as his little force grew out in the fields, the other thing was happening too. The answered click that pulled a man toward a rifle, the silence that swallowed a plea, the bolt mistaken for the toy. The device was doing both of its jobs at once across 40 miles of Normandy, and no man on the ground could know, in the moment he pressed the little brass tongue and waited, which job it was about to do for him. There were, that night, clicks that gave a man away and clicks that summoned death out of a friendly-sounding dark. And there were also, in the same fields, in the same hours, clicks that reached across the black and closed a hand around a life just before the trigger came back, moments where the thin metallic snap arrived in the half-second between the raised pistol and the shot, and turned a killing into a reunion. Those were the moments the survivors would return to most often when they were old and the war was long over, the click that came in time. Consider the country a man had to work with in those last hours before dawn. A field in the Norman bocage was not a field as an American farm boy understood the word. It was a box. Earthen banks 4 and 5 and 6 feet high enclosed every parcel, banks grown over 1,000 years into solid ramparts of packed soil and root, crowned with hedge so thick and so old that a man could not see through it, and often could not push through it at all. Between the boxes ran the sunken lanes, worn down below the level of the fields by centuries of cartwheels and rain, until they became roof tunnels of green, dark even at noon, and pitch black at 2 in the morning. A paratrooper who came down into that landscape came down into a maze built to a scale that had nothing to do with him, a maze in which 20 yards was a horizon, and the man in the next field might as well have been in the next province. Sounded strange things in it. A voice carried where a body could not go. A footstep in one lane could be heard 3 fields over and located nowhere. And into that acoustic labyrinth the Airborne had thrown a device that spoke a single, sharp, carrying syllable. A snap that travelled over the banks the men could not cross. A small brass voice that could reach the friend the eye could not find. It was in exactly that country, on the morning of June 6th, that a captain of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment began to gather the men who would fight one of the most studied small actions of the entire war. Richard Winters had jumped as part of Easy Company's stick, and like nearly everyone else in the 2 divisions, he had come down separated from most of the men he was supposed to lead. His weapons and much of his gear were gone in the drop, torn away in the opening shock or lost in the leg bag that let go in the slipstream. He had a knife. He had, like the others, the little brass clicker pressed into his palm in England, and the brief that had gone with it. The brief every jumpmaster had delivered in the roar of the C-47s, spoken close to each man's ear so it would carry over the engines. 1 click, and you wait, and you count on hearing 2. 1 click challenges, 2 clicks answer, never twice from the same place. Muffle it in your fist so the sound goes where you want it, and not into the whole hedgerow at once. That was the whole of it, and in the fields west of Utah Beach that morning it was, for scattered men, nearly the whole of the plan they had left. Slow the morning down to the pace at which it was actually lived. A man alone in a sunken lane does not move as men move in daylight. He moves a few feet and stops. He puts his back to the earthen bank and lets his breathing settle and makes himself part of the shadow, and he listens with an attention that hurts, because everything in the dark could be the thing that kills him. He hears the wind work the top of the hedge. He hears, far off, the drone of aircraft that are no longer his, and the cough of flak, and the flat concussion of something heavy landing somewhere he cannot place. He hears water, because half the fields around him are flooded, the Germans having opened the sluices to drown the low ground, and the water is a constant liquid murmur that hides footsteps and swallows cries. And then he hears something closer, a stir on the other side of the bank, cloth against branch, or a boot finding purchase in soft ground, or simply the pressure of another living presence a few feet away in the black, the animal certainty that he is not alone in his box anymore. This is the moment the whole night had been building toward, the moment 10,000 men lived separately in the dark that morning, each of them alone with it. The stir on the other side of the hedge could be a friend. It could be a German patrol working the lanes, and the Germans knew this country the way the Americans knew their own back roads. It could be nothing, a cow, a hare, the wind lying to a frightened man. And the trooper has, in his hand, the one instrument that can ask the question without giving the whole answer. He cannot call out. A word in English is a bullet's invitation. A word in the wrong accent could get him shot by his own side. But the cricket asks in a language that has no accent, that means nothing to the ear that has not been told what it means. He brings the little brass thing up. He closes his fist around it to aim the sound at the bank, at the stir, and not at the open field behind him, and he presses the tongue. Click. The sound is smaller than a man expects it to be. It is a dry, sharp, insect snap. The exact sound the toy had made in a Birmingham nursery 20 years before, the sound a band leader had made to bring his players in on the beat. Here it means, I am here. Are you my kind? And then comes the part that the survivors described as the longest interval of their lives. Not because it was long in seconds, but because everything a man had rode across it. The weight. He has committed. He has put a sound into the dark, and the dark now knows where he is. And if what is on the other side of that bank is an enemy, then he has just told the enemy exactly where to point the rifle. There is no taking it back. The click is spent. He waits in the silence he has made, pistol or knife ready, muscles wound so tight they tremble, counting a count that has no numbers, listening for the one thing that will decide it, and then, spring steel, 2 of them, click, click. 2 clicks in the dark, from a hand a few feet away, from a man who is doing exactly what the same jump master told him to do, over the same engines 2,000 feet above the channel. 2 clicks that mean, yes, you're kind, come out. The sound of it arrives in the chest before it arrives in the mind. Every account that touches this moment reaches for the same inadequate words. Relief, so total and so physical that men's knees went, that a hardness in the throat let go, that the whole coiled apparatus of readiness collapsed at once into something close to weeping. Taylor found the only phrase that ever really held it, the most pleasant sound he ever heard in the entire war. Not the guns falling silent at the end, not the word of the surrender a year later. This. 2 dry snaps from an unseen friend in a hedgerow, in the worst dark of the worst night, when a man had made his peace with dying alone in a foreign field, and was answered instead by the news that he was not alone, that the war he had lost had a piece of itself right here on the other side of the bank, close enough to touch. And so the men step out. That is the physical fact at the heart of it, the thing the device made possible. That a man could step out from cover in the middle of enemy country and not be shot by the shadow he was walking toward. Winters gathered his stick and pieces of others this way through the small hours. Each answered, click adding a man, then 2, then a fistful, and the fistful became a patrol, and the patrol became a force with a mission again. This was the cricket working exactly as its designers had prayed it would work, as the amplifier of cohesion, the quiet nervous system of a unit that had been blown apart and was pulling itself back together node by node in the dark. Every one of those men had come down alone. Every one of them had lain in a lane with the same terrible calculation, and the brass toy had let them find each other without the shout that would have brought the Germans, without the challenge and password that a frightened man might get wrong, without the fatal exposure of a called name. By the grey edge of dawn, Winters had enough men, and enough of their weapons recovered from the fields, to move against a target that had announced itself with the flat crack of artillery. The guns were dug in behind the hedgerows near a manor at Brecourt, a battery firing onto one of the causeways that led up off Utah Beach, the very causeways the Airborne had been dropped to open. A handful of men, assembled in the dark by 2 dry clicks at a time, went in against a defended battery across open ground and along the hedged banks, and by the time the morning was fully up they had silenced the guns and cleared the position at a cost that seems impossible against what they took. The action would be taught for generations afterward in the schools where officers learn to do the arithmetic of the improbable. How few can beat how many, given surprise and ground and nerve. But underneath the tactics, at the very root of it, was the assembly. There is no Brecourt without the men, and there are no men without the method by which they found one another in the dark, and that method, for the paratroopers of the 101st, was in large part the small brass thing pressed into the palm in England, the 5-cent toy that had let a scattered company become a fist before the sun came up. A life saved by a click was not an abstraction that morning. It was a specific man stepping out from a specific bank into a war he had thought he'd lost, and then walking an hour later against the guns. Multiply that. Not the battle, the moment, the click, the wait, the answer, the man stepping out. It happened in fields whose names never made it into any book, between men whose names are gone, hundreds of times across those 40 miles of hedgerow before the light came. Every one of them was the whole war in miniature, the total isolation, the mortal question, the small brass answer, the reunion, and every one of them was at the same time riding on the thin thread that the story had already made plain, that the answer only came if the man on the other side of the bank knew the plan, held the toy, and was a friend. Where all three of those were true, the cricket worked its small miracle. Where any one of them failed, the click went out into a dark that gave back either nothing or something worse. The device did not know the difference. It only carried the question. The dark decided the answer. Then the light came, and the questions stopped being asked. Dawn in Normandy on the 6th of June came slow and grey, a thickening of the air from black to charcoal to a flat pewter that resolved, minute by minute, the shapes the night had hidden. The hedgerows became hedgerows again, not walls of pure dark but green banks a man could see the top of. The flooded fields showed themselves, sheets of pale water where the reflected sky lay across drowned meadow. And with the light came the thing the whole Airborne plan had been reaching for from the moment the first jumper went out the door: visibility. A man could see the man across the field now. He could see the shape of a helmet, the cut of a uniform, the line of a jump smock, and know at a glance what the cricket had taken a mortal gamble to establish in the dark. The eye did in an instant and safely what the ear had done all night at the price of a man's life on every attempt. The isolation broke too from the other direction. Off to the east, beyond the drowned fields and the last banks, the sea had come alive. The naval guns opened, and their concussion rolled inland across the bocage, and behind them the first waves were grinding up onto Utah's sand. American forces, visible, massed, unmistakable, were coming ashore and pushing toward the causeways the paratroopers had bled all night to open. The scattered men in the fields were no longer islands in a German ocean. The tide of their own army was rising toward them. The single most dangerous condition the cricket had been invented to address, the lone man in the dark, unable to tell friend from foe, was dissolving in the daylight and the noise of the beachhead, and dissolving fast. And so the men reached the end of the 24 hours, or reached the daylight that made the 24 hours moot, and did the last thing the brief had told them to do. They got rid of the crickets. The order had been clear from the start, and its logic had only sharpened overnight. The device was to be used for the first day only, then discarded or hidden, because the great fear, the fear that had haunted the whole scheme, was that the Germans would capture the toy, learn the protocol, and turn it. A single click in a hedgerow that was answered by 2 clicks meant to lure. The signal that summoned friends could summon them into a killing ground. That risk was tolerable only while the signal was fresh, and the night was total. In the daylight, with the beach forces arriving, the risk far outweighed any use. So the clickers came out of pockets, and the men considered them. Here the accounts diverge, and the divergence is the human heart of the thing. Many did exactly as ordered. They threw the little brass toys into the hedgerows, dropped them in the sunken lanes, worked them down into the soft Norman earth with a boot heel. Small acts done without ceremony by exhausted men, a flick of the wrist and the cricket was gone into the green. And yet the act carried a weight out of all proportion to the object. To throw the cricket away was to close the night. It was to declare the worst of it over, the falling in the dark, the drowning fields, the endless calculation of the answered and unanswered click, the friends found and the friends never found. A man who dropped his cricket into a hedgerow at dawn on June 6th was setting down, in that motion, the whole solitary terror of the hours behind him and stepping into the different war of the daylight, visible, collective, still lethal, but no longer alone. Some described it as pure relief, the tossing away of a thing that had held their lives in the balance all night. Others could not quite name what they felt as the toy left their hand and vanished into the bank. And some did not throw them at all. Some men, against orders or in the confusion where orders had frayed, kept the crickets. They pushed them down to the bottom of a pocket and buttoned the flap and carried them on, through the days of hedgerow fighting that followed, through the campaign, home. They could not have said precisely why. The cricket was not a weapon. It was worthless once the daylight came and the signal was dead. But it was the one small thing a man had held in his hand through the longest night of his life, the thing that had answered him out of the dark or that he had used to answer another, and to keep it was to keep a piece of that night that no photograph and no medal could hold. These were the crickets that survived. The brass tongues that had snapped their one syllable into the Norman dark and then gone quiet in a pocket for the rest of the war, brought back across the ocean, set on a shelf, handed eventually to a son or a museum, small and dull and utterly ordinary to a hand that had not been in that hedgerow, and priceless to the hand that had. So the crickets scattered, as the men had scattered, some driven into the ground of Normandy where the drop had thrown them, some carried away in the pockets of the living, and in the years that followed, both kinds surfaced. Farmers turning the soil of the bocage, working the same fields their families had worked for centuries, would now and then feel the plough catch on a small hard thing and lift out a corroded lump of brass, green with age, and recognise the little tongue and the little frame for what it was. Men with metal detectors, walking the drop zones in the decades after, dug them up by ones and twos from the earthen banks, the exact banks the paratroopers had crouched against, listening. Each one had been pressed once, hard, by a frightened hand in the dark, and then dropped, and had lain there through every season since, holding its one silent syllable in the ground. And the kept ones went into glass. They can be seen now in the museums, at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, at the Airborne and Special Operations Museum in Fayetteville. The authentic wartime crickets, rare because so many were thrown away and so few brought home, resting on their little stands under labels that try in a sentence or two to say what they were. What, in the end, were they? A verdict is harder to write than the legend suggests, and the honesty of the thing requires that both halves be held at once. On one side stand the men who lived because of it, the scattered troopers who found each other in total dark without a shout, the companies that reassembled from nothing, the fists that formed and struck at Bracoeur, and the causeways and the crossroads, the specific lives connected by two dry clicks across a bank. Those men credited the toy, and they were right to. On the other side stand the ambiguities the story could never quite scrub out. The click that carried a lone man's position to a listening enemy, the snap of a rifle bolt mistaken in the dark for spring steel, the answered click that pulled a man toward the very thing he was trying to avoid, and the persistent, undocumented fear that the Germans learned the signal and used it to kill. Both are true. The cricket saved lives and it cost them, sometimes in the same hour in fields 2 miles apart, and the difference between the two outcomes was never in the brass. It was in the men, whether they had a unit, a plan, a friend on the other side of the bank who knew what the sound meant. The 5-cent toy could carry the question flawlessly. It could never decide the answer. It only ever amplified what was already there, and in the chaos of that night what was already there was for some men cohesion, and for others absolute solitude. That is the whole of it. A child's timekeeper, born in a Birmingham workshop for the pleasure of bands and nurseries, was carried by the thousand into the worst darkness of the 20th century's greatest invasion. And there it did the only thing it had ever been able to do. It made a small, sharp, honest sound, and waited to be answered. Sometimes it was. Sometimes the dark stayed dark. The men who held it came home or did not, grew old or did not, and those who lived returned in their memories, over and over across the decades, not to the guns or the medals or the beach, but to the click that came in time, the 2 dry snaps out of the black that meant a friend was near, that the night had not swallowed them after all. So picture it one last time, at the very end, in the last hour before the grey came up, an unnamed hedgerow, an unnamed man, one of thousands, his back to the cold earthen bank, His breath held, some stir on the other side, his fist closing around the little brass frame, the tongue pressed down, and the sound goes out. One click, small and sharp and final, into the dark that has not yet answered. And then the silence, the interval, the whole war balanced on it. And now you know exactly what that silence held.